Hi everyone, welcome back to the third lecture on public opinion. This will be the last one. And the topics that we're going to talk about today are really, they build on the foundation of the previous two lectures. We're not going to mention John Zoller's theory specifically here, but I hope you can see that all of the things we're going to talk about regarding how to interpret polls are built directly on the foundation that he laid. And so when you interpret polls, you do have to be very careful. You have to give a little thought to it. And I'm going to give some guidance about that, especially when we're heading into the election. Right now, the Democratic and Republican presidential conventions are going on. And following the end of the Democratic presidential convention, that's when most Americans will start paying attention. That's when changes in the national polls become meaningful. So if you want to know where the race stands, or who's ahead, who's behind, who is rising or falling in the polls, hopefully this lecture will help you understand that. First, let's talk about polling methods. And polling has become a cottage industry. There are billions of dollars that get spent every year on political surveys and polls. It's important to go back a little ways and learn the history of it. So in the 1930s, you had a now very famous gentleman known as George Gallup, who was a journalism major at the University of Iowa. And his specialty, he did his PhD in journalism at the University of Iowa. And back in the 30s, marketing campaigns relied a lot on polling. Some of the things that George Gallup did after he got his PhD and began to work in the marketing industry was he ran an advertising firm that did polls of radio audiences and Hollywood movie plots, where he would ask people, here's several plots to a movie, which one are you most interested in? And so as a way for Hollywood and radio advertisers to figure out how best to market and advertise to the public, which meant that he had a professional background in polling. He helped his mother when she ran for Secretary of State. He was one of the first people to ever use these polling methods to poll the public during a political campaign, to figure out, okay, what messages should his mother use when she's running as a candidate for Secretary of State. And later, after that, he realized that there is a complete lack of scientific polling nationally. The polls that had been done before were very bad. A major magazine, for instance, would include a little card in the magazine that the readers would rip out and would check whether they supported one candidate or another, and they'd mail back. And then the magazine would collect that and add them up, and that would be their prediction for the election. Now, obviously, subscribers to a magazine are not a representative sample of the public. Only people who can afford the magazine, only people who are interested in the topic of that magazine would actually be part of the poll, not the general public. And so these quote polls, or these surveys that were done before Gallup came along, were very bad, and they tended to be very, very inaccurate. It was Gallup's academic and business background that gave him an eye towards being objective and accurate with his polls. Because people paid him to do the polls, they demanded accuracy. And they expected him to accurately measure the attitudes of the public. He brought that into the political realm. So he had a focus on scientific polls. We're going to explain what scientific means in a second, but the point is the importance of the Gallup poll, which is still one of the most respected and largest polling firms in the entire country. But because the Gallup poll had this academic and business background and focused on scientific polling, it quickly became one of the largest and most respected polling firms in the United States, and it's still considered one of the most respected ones nationally. Now, polling has become a huge cottage industry. There's huge money in it. Billions of dollars every year is spent on polling and gauging the public's attitudes about politics. To give you a sense of how much money we're talking about, an average campaign for the House of Representatives or for the Senate will typically pay a polling firm around $40,000 to $50,000 for a single poll, and often those campaigns will hire pollsters to run between 10 to 15 polls in the months before the election. So you can imagine, if you become good at the scientific polling methods, that you can make a lot of money in this industry. So what do we mean by scientific polling? What makes a poll valid? Let's look at two different polls that were taken in 2008 presidential election. First of all was an AOL internet poll. America Online used to be a large company, a very popular company for internet access. On their website, they put a poll, and people who went to their website could click whether they were voting for McCain or Obama. And their results, they got over 350,000 total responses in this poll, and 65% of the public said they were voting for McCain. Compare that to a Gallup poll taken at the same time. This poll only had 2,300 responses, and they did a telephone survey of the entire American public, and they found that Obama had 51% of the vote and McCain had 45% of the vote. Now, obviously, if you remember the 2008 election, President Obama won. John McCain did not. And so the Gallup poll, even though it had much smaller number of respondents, was actually more accurate than the huge AOL internet poll. Why is that? It has to do with how the people were chosen for it. The AOL internet poll, only people who went to that website and only people who cared enough to actually participate in the poll were counted, which meant that it was not representative of everybody in the country. They were chosen in a way that were selective, and obviously that there were far more McCain supporters who participated in the poll, which is to say that how you select the people for the poll is very, very important. So the Gallup poll, on the other hand, they called people on the phone, but importantly, they randomly selected people from the entire United States. It was not simply people who had internet access and who went to the AOL website and who wanted to participate. Everybody in the United States had a chance to have their voice heard in the Gallup poll. And that's the definition of random. Right? And this is very, very important. You cannot understand which polls are valid and which ones are not without understanding what we mean by random. Random has a very specific definition. It means that every citizen has the same chance of being selected. It does not mean that every citizen is selected. That's a common myth about polls. Somebody will look at a poll and go, well, that's only 1,000 people. How can 1,000 people represent the entire United States? Well, the reason is that everybody in the United States has the same chance of getting selected, and therefore the poll is representative of the country, even though it's a smaller number of people. So random selection is the key to scientific polling. If you see a poll and you find out that the people were not selected in a random way, that poll is not valid. You cannot trust the results of that poll. If it is randomly selected, you can have more confidence in it. That does not mean that polls are always right. They certainly are not. This is not a statistics class. If it were, I'd go into depth about why polls are sometimes wrong. But suffice it to say that polls that use random selection are right far, far more often than polls that don't use it. And you can see the results with the AOL Internet survey. It was way off. The Gallup poll was much more accurate. It was off by about 1% of the actual vote, but that's a small difference, right? The Gallup poll was much more accurate than the AOL Internet poll, and it has to do and the reason is that Gallup used random selection and the AOL poll did not. So, selecting random polls. Random, again, does not mean haphazard. It doesn't mean you walk outside and just grab whoever's out on the street, right? It's also the only way to guarantee a representative sample in the poll. So, how does this work? Poll randomly selects 1,000 to 2,000 people from across the country. They ask people questions and they count the answers. It creates what we call a point estimate. By the way, I'm going through this quickly. This is not in red. It's just to give some background. But the point estimate, for instance, 45% of the public approve of Obama. Now, this is an important concept. The larger the sample, the more accurate the poll, but that's only true with random samples. With the internet poll, the AOL Internet poll, they had 350,000 people. Well, that would be more accurate, right? No, because it wasn't randomly selected. With a random sample, the larger the sample, the more accurate the poll. Without a random sample, you're pretty much just slinging stuff on the wall and you don't know where it's going to hit or what's going to stick. You don't know how accurate the poll is going to be, and oftentimes the poll is going to be very, very inaccurate if it does not use random selection. Accurate in this case simply means how close it is to actual public opinion. let's say 44% of the public, if you could count every single person in the United States and you asked them, do you approve or disapprove of the job President Obama is doing, and you counted up all of the yeses and all of the nos, let's say that 44% of them said yes, that they approve of the job President Obama is doing. Now, let's say that you do a poll that's a random selection of about 1,000 people. The result of that random selection is going to be a little different from the actual population. When we say it's more accurate, we mean that the results are closer to that 44%. So Gallup, will have 45%. Another poll may show 43% approval, and yet another poll may show 46%, right? But they're not going to be wildly off. You're not going to have a poll where Obama's approval comes in at 70% when the actual public is 44%. So the larger the sample, it means it's just polls tend to cluster more tightly around the true population. So this is what we call the margin of error. It's plus or minus some percentage point. So Gallup did a poll of 1,000 people. 45% of those people said they approve of Obama. And in this case, what that really means is that you have to consider the sampling error. Most polls, this is a Fox News poll, most polls have about a random national sample of 1,000 people, and I'll explain why 1,000 people in a second. With 1,000 people randomly selected, the sampling error is typically plus or minus 3%. So what that means is that, let's say Fox News did a poll, 45% of the public approved of Obama. What it actually means is that real approval rating for the entire country is somewhere between 42 to 48%. So we think of it as a range. Unfortunately, when polls are discussed in the media, they rarely talk about this margin of error. They rarely cast it as a range. They say 45% of Americans approve of the job that Obama is doing, as though that were the actual number, and we know it's not. So that's one thing to understand about polls, is that they'll be off, but they'll be off by just a little bit. What is a little bit? In this case, with a random selection of 1,000 people, they may be off by about plus or minus 3%. Going back to this notion that the larger the sample size, the more accurate the poll, the margin of error is a measure of the accuracy of the poll. All that means is that the larger the sample size, the smaller the margin of error. But notice it's not a straight line, right? Notice that right about here, things start tapering off. And for each 100 people you add to the poll, the decline in the margin of error is much smaller. So what does that mean? Let's take a look at the numbers. Why do most polling firms stick with about 1,000 people? 900 people for one poll, 1,200 for another. It has to do with money. There is a cost per person. And if you notice over here, the typical cost per person for a poll is about $20. It takes about $20 to pay somebody to make the phone calls, to have the software, to, just the time and energy. So about $20 per person. A sample size with 400 randomly selected people will have a margin of error of about 5%, which means that poll costs $8,000 to conduct. Let's say that you want your margin of error a little lower. You want to drop it by 1%. Well, you have to add 200 people to get that drop, and that increases the cost to $1,200,000. Let's say you want to drop the margin of error by 1 more percent. Notice you have to double the sample size, which means you've doubled the price of the poll. So with a sample size of 600, you have a margin of error of 4%. With a sample size of 1,200, you have a margin of error of 3%. The 4% margin of error, the poll costs $12,000. 3% costs $24,000. Let's say you want to get it a little more accurate and you want to drop that margin of error down to 2%. Well, guess what? You have to double the sample size again, which doubles the cost of the poll. This is why polling firms tend to stick with about 1,000 people, and why most of them have a margin of error of about plus or minus 3%, because when you get to this point, decreasing the margin of error doubles the cost of the poll. And decreasing it even more is going to make the cost of the poll increase exponentially. And so most polling firms have just decided, okay, they're comfortable with a 3 to 4% margin of error, and they can sell their polls to campaigns. It costs them about $24,000. They can sell the results of the campaign for about $40,000 or $50,000. That's a good margin. So the reason that most of the polls have about 1,000 people each has to do with money. So that's the ideal. Let's talk a little bit about the reality. The reality is that a truly random sample is very difficult. What about people who don't have phones? What about people who work long hours and are not home during the day when the polling firms call them? What about people who don't care about politics? Well, they're less likely to answer the question, and they're more likely just to hang up on the pollster. And the reality is that polling firms have found what we call declining response rates. Response is just the percent of people who answer the phone who are willing to take the poll. Well, that's been declining as well, and now polling firms are very happy if they can get a 15 or 20% response rate. In other words, most polls will have to call 100 people just to get 15 or 20 people to respond to the poll, which means that they have to call tens of thousands of people to get a sample size of about 1,000. So accurate polling is difficult, and it's becoming more difficult with the use of cell phone only. More people are cutting landlines and only using their cell phone. Yet, it's not impossible. This is another common myth about polls. People say, well, there's response rates that are low, and they can't get a truly random sample, so they're all worthless, and they just dismiss all the polls. That's actually wrong. Most polls are accurate. If you look at the polls taken during over the weekend or the day before Election Day, they're typically only off by about 2 or 3%, which is exactly what we would expect given the margin of error. Let's turn now and talk about how do you interpret the polls. Here's some tips and advice. First of all, context matters in a big way. The results of a poll depend heavily on the context in which it was taken. You look at elite debate. Here's an example, the public option. You may not remember, but when Obamacare was being debated and passed through the Senate, one of the proposals was a public option, which meant an actual government-run insurance company that people could buy that would compete with the private insurance companies. In June, a majority of Republicans actually supported this idea. And when the polls came out, a lot of media commentators at the time actually claimed that that was the most likely of the various proposals to pass. People thought that a public option would pass the Congress very easily. The reality is that by August, majority of Republicans around the country opposed the idea. Why was that? Well, frankly, it's because the idea of a public option is very antithetical to Republican ideology and conservative ideology. Conservatives do not like the idea of a government-run insurance company. Republicans in Congress especially were never going to support that. And so it wasn't until the Republicans in Congress came out and opposed the idea that the majority of Republicans among the American public then began to change their view. Before then, the only thing they heard about the public option, they heard very little, and the only thing they heard was typically positive. Only when their side started opposing it in the media, in the news outlets, did they become opposed to the idea. And that, again, going back to John Zoller's theory, that should make perfect sense. Because when Republican politicians and Republican elites, when they oppose an idea, then Republicans are going to accept those negative messages against the public option, and they're going to reject the positive ones because it isn't coming from their side. So polls eventually catch up to the elite debate. A good example of this is the NSA debate and the wiretapping debate about the NSA, a government agency, secretly wiretapping or collecting information about people's phone calls and internet email usage. And won't get into the details of that debate, but during the Bush administration, Democrats were strongly opposed to that idea. During the Obama administration, when Obama was in charge of the NSA, Democrats suddenly became much more supportive of the idea. So during the Bush administration, when the NSA was doing this, a majority of Democrats said they opposed it. When Obama became president, after his election in 2008, majority of Democrats flipped and said they support it. Why? Because the person who was in charge of it was a Democrat. So they accepted the arguments from the Democrats in favor of it, whereas the Democratic arguments during the Bush administration were against it because Bush was a Republican. The second major part of context that matters hugely in terms of interpreting the polls is timing. Here's another example. April 15th, 1999, a majority of Americans said that they opposed gun control. In April 28th, 1999, a majority said they supported. That's just a couple of weeks, right? In a couple of weeks, a majority of Americans went from opposing gun control to supporting it. Why? Well, frankly, it was Columbine. The Columbine attacks occurred between the April 15th and April 28th polls, and Columbine became a major consideration. It was all over the news, and it was something that was bouncing around people's heads. Again, going back to Zoller, right? Opinions are a sample of considerations bouncing around people's heads. In this case, a major event occurred that created a new consideration, and a large number of people, their quote opinions or their responses on the polls changed. And by July 1st, 1999, the majority was back to opposing gun control. So even big major tragedies only have a short-term impact. And this is pretty true regardless of the nature of the tragedy. This could be a terrorist attack, this could be a shooting, this could be any type of a major national event. It will shift the polls, sometimes dramatically, but typically that shift only lasts for a couple of months. Why is that? Again, because the American public doesn't pay a lot of attention to the media, and with the 24-hour news cycle we have now, the media quickly goes on to another story. And so that big traumatic event that was a consideration at the top of their head at the time, it just becomes forgotten. And months later, there's another set of considerations bouncing around people's head, or another big topic of debate that's getting discussed in the news, and the issue of gun control in this case just slips off the public agenda, and people revert back to, whatever it is that is going on. So the two main contexts that you have to look for when interpreting polls are the nature of elite debate and also the timing in which the poll occurs. A poll about gun control that's taken right after a major tragedy or a major traumatic shooting is going to have very different results than one that's taken months or even years after that event has occurred. A couple of other small tips. Compare across a lot of polls. What I mean by this is that there is an unfortunate tendency, especially among politicians and partisans, to cherry pick which poll they like the best. For instance, right now, you see a situation where Trump supporters in the Trump campaign is touting a Rasmussen poll that shows that Donald Trump is ahead of Hillary Clinton by 7%. The reality is that is the only poll that shows Donald Trump ahead by that percentage right now. So the better way to do it is to look at all of the polls taken in the last week or two. And all of those together point to a small Clinton lead. Now, you compare all of those polls to all of the polls a couple of weeks ago, and that Clinton lead has shrunk. So Clinton is no longer as far ahead as she was just a couple of weeks ago. Also look at the wording. What if you have a case where a lot of different polls ask the question in a lot of different ways, but you get the same results? You can have more confidence that that's a solid opinion. So for instance, if you have a poll about gun control, and you have one question that points to a particular shooting and another poll that doesn't mention that shooting, then and the two polls have about the same results, you can be more confident in that the results are somewhat of a solid opinion by the public. If question wording creates dramatically different results, then it means that public opinion is very fluid and that it can change depending on the context. Let's talk about approval ratings specifically. This is the most common polling result that people talk about in politics. You see approval ratings a lot being discussed, especially in the lead up to an election. Also understand, approval rating reflects current events. So let's talk about Bush approval. In 2001, following 9/11, as I showed you before, his approval rating was about 90%. You fast forward to 2006, during the Iraq War. The Iraq War was not going very well. We had a lot of troop deaths and a lot of violence occurring during the time, and his approval slipped. Go even farther, 2008, not only was the Iraq War still not going very well, but the economy was in the gutters. The largest economic recession since the Great Depression, and his approval ratings dropped down to about 20%, some of the lowest of any president in the history of the country. So it shows you just how dramatically people's attitudes about the president can change and how that change can reflect current events. After 2001, after the 9/11 attacks, Bush showed strong leadership and people changed their opinion. They approved of him. 90% approval in 2001. Right before he left office, his approval was down to 20%. And you can see here the ups and downs. This is a Gallup poll over time, asking the same question: do you approve or disapprove of the job that George W. Bush is doing as president? You notice he started out with about 50%. After 9/11, it jumped up slowly went back down to about 50%. The Iraq War began. People rallied behind the president, and it started slipping again. Then here in 2000, right before 2004, Saddam Hussein was captured. That was a good thing. And then afterwards, public opinion started to decline again. And then from 2005 down to the end of his presidency, it was just a series of one policy or political controversy after the other. And ended with a financial bailout and his approval rating below 25%. So again, you can see here visually the ups and downs of public opinion and how you have to look at the current events or the political context that's going on at the time. So let's turn and talk about Obama's approval. In 2008, Obama wrote in with all the hopey-changey rhetoric, and he had very high approval ratings, particularly because the economic recession, he was elected based on that, which we'll talk about when we talk about voting. By 2009, he passed a controversial health care law. It was unpopular, and so his approval ratings declined. By 2010, the economy was still in the gutters. The economy was still very bad, and his approval ratings sunk even lower, down, I believe, below 40%. By 2012, there's some modest gain in the economy, and Obama's approval rating was back up into the mid-40% range, and so he won re-election. So again, you can see sort of the ups and downs. Let's wrap up the discussion about polls with by addressing a common myth that's out, which is, are polls worthless? We just talked about how polls do not tell us the exact percentage of Americans who believe something. We talked before about how most Americans don't even have political beliefs, so the answers they give to the polls are just a sample of whatever's bouncing around the top of their head, and whatever's bouncing around the top of their head is going to change from one day to the next. So does that mean that polls are worthless, that you just can't trust them? The answer is no. It simply means you have to use some caution when looking at the polls or listening particularly to the news media talk about the polls. You never take them at face value. If a poll says 45% of Americans support gun control, you do not believe that exactly 45% of Americans support gun control. The real number is between 42 to 48%, and it may be that there has not been a national tragedy, right? The result might be higher following that. It might be lower now because something else is in the news and people just aren't thinking about it. So you don't take it at face value. You trust in the number, but you understand that the numbers are not exact. Again, context and timing are really critical for understanding the results of a poll. And a leak debate is also very important. If the poll reflects a debate that's coming up in the future, right, you have to think that the Republicans and Democrats are going to divide, and if it looks like a majority of Democrats support a policy at the time that Democrats in Congress are not going to accept, that number is going to drop. By the time the policy gets to a vote in Congress, people are going to be aligned with their party, and so the polling results are going to be much different. And finally, just to wrap all this up and bring it back to Zoller, Zoller's theory helps us understand this. And it tells us, again, why polls are not worthless, why we can make some meaningful inferences from the polls as long as we're cautious. In Zoller's theory, considerations drive people's responses to the polls, right? So look at what considerations are being talked about in the news, and look at the considerations that are being put out there by the parties, the arguments that are being put out there by the party, and you'll know where most Republicans and most Democrats stand on the issue. So that's all we're going to talk about the polls. Hopefully this was not too painful. I know that it can sometimes be a dry topic, but I'm going to wrap up and talk about the upcoming presidential election for a few minutes. Right now, if you look at the polls, and by the way, I'm going to send you a very good website where you can keep track of the current polls, if you want to. But right now, the standing in the polls are that Hillary Clinton has about a 2 to 4% lead in the polls, somewhere in that area. So if the election were held today, Hillary Clinton would be very likely to win by a small margin. That does not mean that Hillary Clinton will eventually win the presidency. We don't know who's going to win the presidency yet, and the polls are going to change between now and November. Now, right now, as I'm recording this, The Republican presidential convention is occurring. By the time you hear this, the Democratic presidential convention will be going on. What that means is that right now, the public is hearing 4 days of relatively unfiltered pro-Republican messages. And especially, they're seeing speeches at night about why Trump would be a great president, why he's the best choice, and they're not hearing a lot from the other side. So the composition of information right now favors the Republicans. You can be pretty sure that the polls are going to change in Donald Trump's favor over the next week. When the Democratic convention starts, Democrats are going to get 4 days to make their case to the public of relatively unfiltered access, and they're going to be talking about how great Hillary Clinton is, why Hillary Clinton is the best choice for president, and the polls are going to shift back again to Clinton's favor. After the two nominating conventions are finished, which is, say, after the end of this week, the polls are going to tend to merge back towards a close contest, with one candidate or the other being in the lead by about 2 to 4%. The next major events to watch for are the presidential debates. Those tend to come along in late August through September and into October. Those debates can also shift public opinion, but none of these tend to be long-term. The presidential conventions tend to influence or change the polls, and those changes tend to only last about a week or 2 weeks at the most. The presidential debates, they tend to have an effect for maybe a week and a half. Afterwards, people have forgotten about them, and they go back to, sort of their normal way of thinking about the campaign. All of that's another way of saying that the polls are not going to give you an indication of who's going to win the election. The polls are going to change all throughout October. When you get towards the end of October, and especially the weekend or the day before Election Day, that's when the polls become very, very accurate at predicting the winner. So in terms of national polling, if you want to pay attention, that's fine. But be cautious, right? Don't latch on to a single poll that shows a large Donald Trump lead or a large Hillary Clinton lead and go, oh, they're going to win. Because, one, that poll could be an outlier. That poll could be very different from all the other polls. Right? And even if all the other polls show that a candidate with a large win, those polls are going to change as you get closer to Election Day. If the majority of polls show, say, Donald Trump with a 5% lead the day before the election, then you can trust that Donald Trump is very likely to win. If the polls show a big Hillary Clinton lead the day before the election, you can be very sure that she's going to win. If the polls show a very close race, the polls are, the two candidates are 1 or 2 percentage points away from each other, then you might as well flip a coin. It's going to be a very close contest, and you can't really know who's going to win. So that's, to quote a great American philosopher, that's all I have to say about that. We're getting the discussion there on public opinion. The next topic we're going to talk about is voting and elections, why people show up to the poll, why they vote for the candidates they do, and especially the latter question about people voting the way they do. We also build on Zoller. So don't just forget about Zoller just because you've taken a quiz on them. The quizzes are not cumulative, but the material is somewhat, and Zoller's theory can help you also understand voting behavior. All right, I hope you enjoyed this series of lectures, and see you next time.